right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our state-focused webinar as part of the release of From State Commitment to District Implementation, Approaches and Strategies for Personalized Competency-Based Learning. I'm Rebecca Wolfe. I'm the Vice President of Impact and Improvement at KnowledgeWorks and one of your co-hosts for the webinar this afternoon. I am going to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about the logistics of today and the agenda, and then I'm going to turn it over to my fellow host, Stewart Hudson, to give a few opening remarks. So just a couple of logistical things. We are in webinar mode, which I'm sure many of you are used to at this point in Zoom land. So you can do two things to participate, and we encourage you to do both. One is we have a Q&A box or a Q&A button. Those will be questions that will go directly to the presenters, in particular our researchers who are here today, and we'll be reserving time at the end to try to address as many of your questions as we can get through. If we don't get to your particular question, we will also share some of our emails at the end so that you should feel free to connect with us afterwards if you don't get everything on your mind answered. The other thing is their chat function is enabled, so we encourage you throughout to share reflections and things. Again, we will be moderating the Q&A for your questions, but we encourage you to connect through chat. And in particular, right now, as we're going through the agenda, would ask that you introduce yourself. And as you introduce yourself, let us know and let your fellow participants know what brought you here today. What is it that you're interested in hearing and reflecting on, and why are you interested in this particular webinar? So what we're going to run through today is Stewart and myself are just going to provide a few opening thoughts and reflections, and then we're going to dive right into the meat of the content. We're fortunate to have our two researchers, the dynamic duo from Research for Action, who led this project, Mark Duffy and Mary Eddins. We'll talk about their key research findings, particularly on the parts of the report that focus on the state level. So the report actually covers both state level findings and district level findings. Today's webinar is going to focus on state. And because we're focused on state, we are fortunate to have Jon Alfuth, our Director of State Policy from KnowledgeWorks, is going to provide some reflections at the end on some specific implications from the reports for state level folks who are thinking about or interested in implementing some of these personalized competency-based approaches. And then, as promised, we will end with a good solid at least 10 minutes of Q&A time. Feel free to direct it to any of us on the webinar. So looking forward to diving in with you, and I will turn it over to Stewart to say good afternoon.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. I only have a few minutes. I don't want to get in the way of what's to follow, but a good place for me to start on behalf of the directors and the staff of the Lowenstein Foundation is to thank KnowledgeWorks for the hard work that they've done to bring this project forward. Also Research for Action, of course, and you'll hear more from them. And again, all of those who contributed to it, not the least of which the folks in North Dakota, South Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada, who are doing the work on a daily basis, but also contributing to the knowledge that will be shared today. Something that I feel honor bound to say is there's a variety of reasons why the Lowenstein Foundation supported this Pcbl project. And one of the reasons is that, as we have seen, Pcbl contributes to dealing with addressing equity in education. So that's something that's clear and makes this very compelling. Second is there's a diversity of states. There was no cherry picking here. These are states that have something to offer and are worth learning more about in terms of that commitment, state support for district implementation. The Lowenstein Foundation has, for a number of years, been interested in personalized competency-based learning, which goes by some other names as well. And we've been supporting building the evidence base for this vast array of elements that contribute to this approach. One of the things that you get when you're trying to build the evidence base is you get some student outcomes that are compelling for talking about why there's so much continued and enduring interest in personalized competency-based learning. But the other equally important is, well, how do you do it? How do you do it right? So here you have 4 very diverse states. You have a very good research organization, and you have KnowledgeWorks sharing this information. We found that very attractive and wanted to have a part in supporting it. Also, the organizational reputation of KnowledgeWorks and research for action. I say research for action in particular because of the last word, action. And one of the things that, if I can, I would say is what we hope the most for is what happens next. As this information is shared, is there more commitment in more states because of this knowledge? Is there a deepening of what's happening already in the 4 states that I mentioned? And are there pragmatic ways to use whatever resources there are available? Maybe there's ESSER funds that won't go to building new gymnasiums in schools, that might go to some other kind of enduring innovation that is much needed. Perhaps that is an example of what this sharing, what this knowledge, what this report can contribute to. But I'm going to stop there because, first of all, you need to hear from the people who actually did the work. And congratulations again to everyone involved.
Thank you so much, Stewart. And just picking up from there on just a couple of my own reflections. So I'm going to, Stewart sort of pushing us to the future. I'm actually going to take us briefly back in time. Almost over 10 years ago now, I helped start the Students at the Center initiative at the time at JFF. And at that time, it was one of the only places that was focused on finding and fostering research that supported student-centered approaches. And so while these ideas have been around, as I'm sure you all know, since the time of Dewey and the progressive era, at that time, there was nobody out there that we could find, or virtually nobody, who was really trying to build an evidence base to even understand how it worked and who it worked most for. We had to convince and cajole and convene and incentivize researchers to take a look at this work. But what we did have at the time were some amazing educators, a handful of couple of dozen schools, and a couple of networks out there who were willing to look at the research, who cared deeply about our most marginalized and resilient learners, and who had their own life-lived evidence to know that we could do differently and do better by kids than what we were doing in schools at the time. So these innovators had really started to build and reconstruct schools and classrooms that truly recognized student voice and students' personal needs, interests, and cultures. And as a researcher, we can't measure and determine impact if it doesn't exist. So it took those early innovators to create proof points and proof of concept so we could start building that research. So flash forward to today, and you can understand why I have so much personal excitement at the ability of what this report helps us do, because we have looked at field growth from these tiny pockets of innovators to hundreds of schools, and to now with the release of this report, we have our first picture of what it could look like at broader scale, not just a single state, but across multiple states. And so the approaches and the logic models and the guiding questions in this report provide that field hungry, missing scaffolding to do 2 key things. First is it helps the implementers, many of whom are on this call, look at scale as you're trying to scale, and to do that with vastly increased efficiency. Because what's in this report enables us to make smarter choices for how we go about the work. We don't need to start from a blank slate. We don't have to invent the wheel because the roadmap is here in this report. And second, it has a critical function for those of us researchers on this call. So it lays the groundwork for that next stage research and evaluation that Stewart started talking about. So the descriptive analysis of what's here lets us start to think about those key exploratory research questions that can finally lead us to the kinds of impact and outcomes measurement that, again, I know we are all hungry for. The last point I want to say is that KnowledgeWorks is continuing to do that data collection to start to build on the logic models and the frameworks that are in this report. And it's the kind of thing that we can't go it alone, and we've never tried to. So as we are collecting more data and looking at the deeper and more nuanced impact and outcome assessment, it is something that we will absolutely be in touch with many of you on this call for, and that we are grateful for the numerous partners that we have out there that make this happen. And one of them, of course, is I am so grateful for Stewart Hudson and the Leon Lowenstein Foundation support of this research, and for being such generative thought partners throughout this. Stewart, I really, truly appreciate all the conversations we've had along the way. And now, even better, Stewart and I will get out of the way and turn it over to Mary and Mark so that they can get to the meat of what you're all looking for.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca and Stewart, for those interesting and really helpful opening ideas. So in looking at the chat, it looks like people are here for a lot of different reasons. Just interested in personalized competency-based learning overall, which is great. Questions about equity and its place in this work, about different ways that policy can support the work, how states can support implementation on the ground. We won't be focusing as much on implementation in this webinar, as Rebecca said, but encourage you to look at the full report because it spends a lot of time looking at district implementation. And so lots of different interest areas. We won't be able to cover everything, but we'll be able to talk about a lot of those things today. So just to start, I want to give you an overview of the study and a little bit about the organization that Mary and I work for, Research for Action. Research for Action, or RFA, is a nonprofit education research organization based in Philadelphia, and we've been around for about 30 years doing exactly this kind of work. We partnered with KnowledgeWorks to document and analyze how personalized competency-based learning is taking hold in the 4 study states that were mentioned and the initial cohort of school districts implementing the work. And just for people who are not quite as familiar, KnowledgeWorks defines personalized competency-based learning as an approach that centers each student's strengths, needs, and interests, and provides differentiated supports and ways to demonstrate what they know and know how to do, ensuring that each learner graduates ready for what's next in their lives. And from the very beginning, the research team at RFA and KnowledgeWorks established 3 goals for the study. The first goal is to document approaches and lessons learned from policy adoption and implementation of personalized competency-based learning. Second goal is to identify how the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been such a huge part of our lives for the last couple of years, impacted the move toward personalized competency-based learning in each state, and to identify how each state defines and operationalizes its equity commitment within the state's personalized competency-based learning efforts. And the study was informed by an array of qualitative sources from the study states and districts. And we too want to thank all the people who were involved in giving us their time and perspectives for this research. We specifically conducted interviews with state-level policymakers and practitioners and conducted a review of documents starting in the spring of 2021 to develop individual logic models for the 4 study states. The logic model development for Nevada took place a little bit later in the fall of 21 and winter 22. So the logic models in the report reflect those time periods. The study also identified a sample of 2 districts in each of the 3 states implementing personalized competency-based learning at the district level currently: Arizona, North Dakota, and South Carolina. And the findings, again, from that analysis are in the report, but won't be a focus of the webinar today. Next slide, please. Great. Okay. So I'm really going to be focusing on creating state-level conditions to support this important work and providing a roadmap that Rebecca was mentioning. So systemic adoption of personalized competency-based learning at the local level really requires support at the state level to remove barriers and assist with implementation. State policymakers and education advocates really need to leverage their individual state contexts and opportunities for policy change in order to gather support for the adoption of personalized competency-based learning locally. Further, to support the implementation of personalized competency-based learning across a cohort of districts, states need to determine their leadership model for the effort, the partnerships that are necessary to provide extra capacity to support the work, the order of local implementation, and determine what scale-up strategies will work for their local context. In this section of the presentation, as I mentioned, we'll present this roadmap of the various approaches to creating state-level conditions that support personalized competency-based learning across the 4 study states. I just want to emphasize that the roadmap examines central components of state efforts, but it does not represent all the possible options available to states, but instead offers decision points for states to consider along the way and strategies based on the work done in the study states that we're focusing on. Next slide. Great. Okay, so the first decision point that we'll be talking about really gets at, what are the potential catalysts for the advancement of personalized competency-based learning? Each of the study states identified at least one catalyst or impetus as an important driver in the advancement of personalized competency-based learning in their local context. These catalysts help to encourage or accelerate the adoption of personalized competency-based learning and build support among state stakeholders to move the work forward with the support of KnowledgeWorks. Policymakers and advocates really need to consider how to identify and leverage these catalysts to gather support for personalized competency-based learning adoption. The first catalyst is the adoption of related legislation and regulation. And in fact, this was common across all 4 study states. Provide one example from Arizona, where in 2010, Move On When Ready was passed, opening the door for new thinking by providing an opportunity for students to earn the Grand Canyon High School diploma based not on traditional measures, but demonstrated mastery of college and career readiness instead of accumulated seat time and high school credits. And that was really a driver for the work even before this initiative began. Changing instructional needs in the wake of COVID-19 has really highlighted the value of personalized competency-based learning in meeting the needs of students where they are. Even as we start to come out of the pandemic, education policy makers and practitioners recognize, of course, the world has changed and that provides an opportunity for education to adapt as well to meet the needs of students. So at the state and local levels, interview respondents we spoke with really reported time and again that schools and districts involved in personalized competency-based learning adapted more quickly than schools and districts not involved in meeting the needs of students during the pandemic. Nevada provides an example here where policymakers really pointed to the pandemic as a catalyst for the personalized competency-based learning effort. Nevada started their personalized competency-based learning work with KnowledgeWorks in the midst of the pandemic, and the instructional needs identified through the pandemic, I think, was a catalyst there and could be a catalyst for other states to really think about what have we learned from the pandemic and how should we shift the way we provide instruction and how might personalized competency-based learning fit into that. Policy around high school graduation pathways is the third catalyst we identified. Really, these sorts of efforts are opening new avenues to earn a high school diploma in new ways for students that allow for more flexibility in meeting state graduation expectations. Next slide, please. Okay, so the second decision point in our roadmap really asks the question, how can personalized competency-based learning advance the larger state vision for education? So of course, this effort, can be one potential vehicle to achieve a state's larger education goals, which are important to recognize. Common goals include helping each student succeed, facilitating educational flexibility and innovation, and supporting state goals for high school graduates. Across study states, there was a recognition that some students simply are not receiving the instruction that they need. And as a result, all 4 study states identified the need to effectively help each and every student succeed, and that personalized competency-based learning could be a strategy to help address these dynamics. Personalized competency-based learning is really all about flexibility and innovation. And so states, are also interested in supporting flexibility in the way that instruction is provided and increase innovation in educational settings. And personalized competency-based learning can really advance that larger vision. And here again, all 4 states provided examples of this type of policy change. Just provide a couple examples. under Arizona House Bill 2862, although students still must receive a minimum number of instructional hours, those hours can be completed in many different ways, including mastery-based learning. In South Carolina, the State Department of Education released an entire education flexibility guide in support of personalized learning that describes many different ways for local leaders to maximize flexibility for innovation, such as exemptions, options, and waiver opportunities available to districts and schools. And then supporting state goals for high school graduates is outlined in a portrait of a graduate, whether at the state or district levels, was a central theme across the study. We heard about this time and again in the different states. This was clearest in South Carolina, where personalized competency-based learning is one way to achieve the knowledge, skills, and dispositions outlined in the profile of a South Carolina graduate. Similarly, a personalized competency-based learning effort in North Dakota is seen as a way to help students graduate choice ready. Next slide, please. Great. So decision point 3 asks the question on our roadmap, what state policy mechanisms can be used to create the conditions that are needed? So state policymakers and education advocates really need to leverage those opportunities for policy change to create the state level conditions that will allow for local adoption and implementation of personalized competency-based learning. And of course, people think to state legislation as the most common mechanism for policy change, but in fact, there were a number of other ones as well. Certainly prior to the personalized competency-based learning efforts in the 3 states, states passed legislation that facilitated adoption at the local level, but even after making the commitment and doing the work with KnowledgeWorks, additional legislation was passed. So there are a few other policy mechanisms that were identified. Commissions and task forces was another. The Blue Ribbon Commission for Globally Prepared Nevada, supported in partnership by the State Department of Education and KnowledgeWorks, has really been central to the growing interest around personalized competency-based learning. And even prior to that commission, in 2015, Nevada's then Governor Sandoval created a competency-based education task force that's really pointed to as the first step in the development of competency-based education in the state. Similarly, in North Dakota, the governor established an innovative education task force with goals around creating a system of identification and support for schools and districts, implementing innovative practices and identifying challenges that could really be improved through student-centered learning experiences. Then the next type of policy mechanism we identified is accountability instructional frameworks. In North Dakota, they've developed a learning continuum. It's a statewide framework that identifies key qualities within a set of learning expectations that really indicates the performance level that students should know and be able to do, which is really critical in providing personalized approaches. South Carolina also offers a framework for personalized learning that supports students in achieving the profile of a South Carolina graduate by fostering things that really line up with personalized competency-based learning around student ownership, learning profiles, and allowing for flexible learning environments. What's also interesting is the use of pilot testing, maybe even before legislation, as a way to inform the policymaking process. Nevada provides an example here where Assembly Bill 10 created the opportunity for schools to participate in a competency-based education network and pilot program. And the pilot program allowed schools to explore the use of competency-based education in classrooms, and then the larger network studied how this was being offered in the state and identifying potential lessons learned. And the pilot program served as a precursor to the Blue Ribbon Commission that I mentioned in the state, and ultimately the expansion of personalized competency-based learning efforts across the state. So lots of different policy mechanisms to consider to support this work beyond just legislation. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's really critical to determine, how is this work going to be led at the state level? And each of the states develop state leadership models for the effort, ranging from a broad coalition of policymakers to a single nonprofit. So Arizona provides the example of the single nonprofit, where the Center for the Future of Arizona, which is a state-based nonprofit organization, really works to attract districts to the work, secure funding, measure success, influence policy change, and directly support districts who are involved in something called the Arizona Personalized Learning Network. Their position outside of state government really provides some autonomy and opportunities to sustain the work, even if there are leadership changes in state government. The next type of leadership model can be found in North Dakota and Nevada, where the State Department of Education serves as a lead agency, but really coordinates multiple offices within the department to work together in support of personalized competency-based learning. In both those states, we're also seeing work around gathering input from a broad coalition of stakeholders at the state level that, to really help build support for the work and scale and sustain it for the long term. So you're really getting buy-in from many stakeholders across the state. The example in North Dakota, the North Dakota Department of Public Instruction is the primary lead, but really had multiple state groups, unions, business associations, lots of different groups involved in discussions in the beginning of the work. And then finally, in South Carolina, we have the fourth leadership model, where you have a single designated office in the State Department of Education that really focuses on the work. And the strong presence of what's been called the Office of Personalized Learning in South Carolina supports statewide coaching, professional development, communities of practice, and targeted supports to school design teams. But it is important to recognize that while primary responsibility rests with the Office of Personalized Learning, the State Superintendent of Education has continued to be a strong supporter of the work, and there's still collaboration happening across offices, but you do have a single office that really spearheads the work in South Carolina. Next slide, please. Okay, and then it's also important to think about in this work, making a decision about who could be the potential partner organizations to provide training and ongoing support. Across the board, this type of effort was really described as hard work that requires ongoing professional development and technical assistance. And the reality is state government capacity may just not be able to provide all the supports that are needed. So additional supports may be found through partnerships. KnowledgeWorks facilitated the development of many different types of partnerships in the study states to provide these supports, including resources from inside and outside the state and from the local, regional, state, and national levels. Districts involved in the KnowledgeWorks effort can act as partners in the work when structured networks of cohort districts are developed. So we never want to underestimate just the value of partnership across districts who are doing the work. In Arizona, as I had mentioned, the Personalized Learning Network primarily consists of the districts involved in the initial cohort of personalized competency-based learning and collaborate together. The 3 lighthouse districts that have been developed in South Carolina are working with the Office of Personalized Learning and KnowledgeWorks to build district-level policies to support personalized competency-based learning in schools and classrooms. And then Personalized SC in South Carolina provides an online platform for this kind of structured network of cohort districts collaborating together. Regional education service centers, I think, are sometimes an untapped resource that can really be important for professional development, ongoing support. An example is the Northeast Education Services Cooperative, which is a regional education association in North Dakota that provide an education fellow to support personalized competency-based learning implementation and participate in the development of the state learning continuum, the development of that. And then along with KnowledgeWorks, states worked with organizations to provide technical assistance for specific areas of the work. Those providers in North Dakota, for example, included the Center for Collaborative Education and Battelle for Kids. And then you can also look inside your state to find partnerships to support this work, and Arizona provides a good example of that, where the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University and A for Arizona are both collaborative state partners. The Teachers College focuses on really working to develop the new set of teachers who are coming out to become familiar with personalized learning initiatives for educators, and that's called the Next Education Workforce. And A for Arizona has worked alongside the CFA in Arizona to propose legislation that better supports personalized competency-based learning. So again, there are these opportunities for state partnerships both inside and outside the state that can be really important to build capacity. Next slide. Okay. So the next decision point, sorry, I need to go back to 6. There you go. So the next decision point is really about what will be the order of implementation from the district to the school level? So this has changed over time, where now in the 3 states where district implementation is taking place, they've really been focusing on both building district systems and policies to support personalized competency-based learning, and working on classroom level, school level implementation simultaneously. Both are critical to successful implementation and can inform one another. But initially, 2 of the study states really began local implementation by focusing first on district system building before school level implementation, while the other focused on implementation at the school and classroom level first. And the next slide. Okay, and our final decision point, really gets at, what are the scaling strategies that will best fit the state political and cultural context where this work is being done. And of course, scaling is so critical to, continuing this work beyond the initial cohort of states. So the 4 states included in the research each have a political culture in which local control is really a dominant dynamic in state education. And so the study states really were smart about considering their local political and cultural contexts and designing strategies for scaling the work beyond the first cohort of districts, realizing the approach needed to be bottom up rather than top down. And so they really are allowing inclusion in this work to be a local decision. Even in South Carolina, where things are most centralized, talk about the districts involved in the work as a coalition of the willing. So collaboration across educators through a peer-to-peer network is another strategy, along with this kind of organic approach. Peers just really like to learn from one another. And so if you can provide those structured opportunities, that can be really a critical strategy for scale and sustainability long-term. In North Dakota and South Carolina, local districts play a role in really demonstrating, acting as demonstration sites for other potential districts who might want to be involved. In North Dakota, the districts in the first cohort are expected to serve as demonstration sites. And then South Carolina, similarly, they use an inquiry lab approach in which classrooms implementing personalized competency-based learning can observe educators in other districts, or can be observed by educators in other districts interested in adopting similar policies. And then finally, there's been the development in a couple of the states of a 3-pronged approach with multiple entry points. So all sites don't have to come to this work in the same way. There's the explore entry point for individual educators interested in exploring the work, launch for individual schools, and then transform for sites where entire districts are ready to get involved in this work. So I want to stop there and just ask another question for the prompt, if you want to add to the chat, and share any takeaways from these decision points that you found especially relevant for your state. We'd love to hear if there are any takeaways that are really meaningful for you and think might be appropriate for your state. But at this point, I want to turn to my colleague, Mary Eddins, who's going to continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Mark. All right, so now I would like to shift our discussion today to focus on research for actions analysis of state strategies to support local adoption and implementation of personalized competency-based learning. As Mark had shared earlier, this portion of our research included developing logic models for each study state's personalized competency-based learning initiative. Each state logic model, which you can find in our full report, include 3 main components. So first, we have resources that states provided or leveraged to adopt, implement, and support personalized competency-based learning. Second, we have implementation activities. And third, we have the desired short-term results and the state vision for long-term impact. These logic models served as an analytic tool for the cross-state analysis, and findings from that analysis are included in the slides that I will share with you now. Okay, so first, I would like to share or highlight the common resources that states provided and leveraged to support local adoption and implementation of personalized competency-based learning. When looking across the state logic models, we identified 4 common types of resources, many falling into the human resource category, that were provided or leveraged for local adoption. So first, we have state policymakers and agencies. Policymakers and agencies helped pass legislation aligned with personalized competency-based learning in all 4 states. This legislation has enabled schools and districts to pursue personalized competency-based learning practices. Next, we have both state-based and external organizations. These organizations supported the efforts in many ways across states, primarily offering professional development and technical assistance for implementation. This was both on a broad level as well as providing support for specific components, such as assisting with the development of a district-level portrait of a graduate. And then lastly, and of course, we have both district leaders and classroom educators. Local stakeholders are truly essential for district-level systems building and implementation to take place. District leaders in the study states ultimately determined overall strategies for adoption and implementation on the ground, while educators used their time and expertise to bring personalized competency-based learning into the classroom. All right, and next I will highlight the implementation activities. So each state logic model also captures implementation activities occurring in each state to support the local adoption of personalized competency-based learning. Our analysis of these activities is framed around the 4 strategies for system design, which is developed by KnowledgeWorks as part of the state policy framework for personalized learning. Later, you will hear more about this framework from Jon from KnowledgeWorks when discussing policy implications. We use these strategies as broad constructs to organize our data collection and analysis without exploring the individual policy condition included under each. So first, to discuss building capacity. Activities to build capacity at the local level included a few things. Hosting convenings was definitely one, which was both in person, mostly before the pandemic, and those moved virtual, of course, during, maybe after, offering ongoing monitoring and coaching, facilitating cross-cohort collaboration, providing technical assistance, and sharing online professional development tools. Support in cultivating systems change was provided through state opportunity analyses, advocacy for aligned state policy, coordination of personalized competency-based learning supports within the state departments of education, and the scaling of personalized competency-based learning. Next, for empowering student learning, states focus primarily on empowering student learning by encouraging student voice and choice across districts. And then lastly, states work to ensure quality by leveraging independent evaluation partners and developing action planning metrics. Okay, so now to move on to discuss goals for the work, which are again also included as components in the developed state logic models and capture both those desired short-term results and the vision for longer-term impact. While study states were still in the process of setting goals for personalized competency-based learning at the time of our data collection, common responses across states regarding goals for the work were shared. So first, for short-term results, thinking 5 or less years away, states hope to see the following: increased educator knowledge about and capacity to implement personalized competency-based learning, the adoption of state and district policies aligned with personalized competency-based learning, the implementation of personalized competency-based learning into classroom instruction, the completion or integration of the portrait of a graduate within districts, increased student agency or ownership over their own learning, the development of metrics to measure the impact of personalized competency-based learning, and lastly here, the development and dissemination of lessons learned. As for longer-term impact, so thinking beyond 5 years, states hope to see the scaling of personalized competency-based learning to more districts within their state, the development of evidence on the impact of personalized competency-based learning on student outcomes, the elimination of student achievement or opportunity gaps, and lastly, increased student readiness for college and career after high school. Now moving on to equity considerations across the states. So again, as Mark had shared earlier, one of the goals of this study was to identify how each state defines its equity commitment within the state's personalized competency-based learning efforts. The definition of equity is nuanced and evolving within the field of education. So instead of evaluating state approaches to incorporating equity into their personalized competency-based learning efforts, Research for Action asked state-level respondents to share their own definitions and considerations around equity as it relates to the effort. A few common themes emerged across states through these discussions. So first, state-level respondents often found it difficult to provide operational definitions of equity, or in other words, define what equity means for this work. But they did express an explicit commitment to equity within the personalized competency-based learning effort. Key factors related to equity were often identified across the study states and included the socioeconomic status of students, special education services received, including gifted services, student race and ethnicity, access to resources, and school academic performance. And lastly, state policymakers involved in personalized competency-based learning emphasized the importance of the effort as a strategy to address issues of equity, with equity primarily discussed as a way to meet the needs of each individual student. All right, so now moving on to key takeaways and recommendations for the field. So based on the state level data collection and analysis, our report provides recommendations for state decision makers leading implementation, as well as those considering supporting personalized competency-based learning efforts in their states. So the first set of recommendations included on this slide are most applicable to creating state level conditions to support the work. So first, we recommend establishing a clear and shared vision and goals for personalized competency-based learning from the outset. It is critical to establish strategic and measurable goals across a coalition of partners at the very outset of any effort so that there is a clear vision for the work. Second, we recommend leveraging catalysts to advance personalized competency-based learning in the state. It is important to recognize and then leverage opportunities to build support for the work and create the conditions needed to adopt and sustain it. Next, to advocate for personalized competency-based learning as a vehicle to achieve the state's larger vision for education. Advocates can identify the state's larger vision for education and then frame personalized competency-based learning as a vehicle to meet that vision. And then second to last year, we have developed state policy that supports the adoption and scale up of the work and orient district leaders on how to leverage these policies in their local context. So policymakers have supported the work through legislation, frameworks, as well as commissions and task forces that created the policy landscapes in which personalized competency-based learning could be adopted and implemented. District leaders will need to help to understand how to take advantage of these policies to adopt and implement personalized competency-based learning in their local context. And then lastly here, build a broad coalition at the state level to provide input in the effort and support the work. In order to build, scale, and sustain support for the effort, policymakers, advocates, service providers, and practitioners from across the state will need to be involved. And then the second set of recommendations here relate directly to state support for local implementation. So first, leverage both internal and external partners to provide ongoing professional development and technical assistance for the work. Due to the complexity and whole-scale nature of personalized competency-based learning, it is a demanding instructional shift that truly requires ongoing professional development and technical assistance. And then more specifically, and building off of that, provide technical assistance to districts on how to focus on both district systems building and school-level implementation. Initially, study states focused on district system building or school-level implementation. More recently, districts have been focusing on both simultaneously, as both are critical to successful implementation and can inform one another. Next, we have identify indicators to measure implementation and impact. In order to track the level of implementation and determine whether an initiative is ready to measure impact, clear and measurable indicators need to be defined. Next, consider the state political and cultural context in determining scaling strategies. Each of the study states have a culture in which local control is a dominant dynamic, and as a result, the decision whether to adopt personalized competency-based learning was a local decision. Other states will need to consider their own dynamics to determine which scaling strategies fit their local context best. And then lastly, develop a clear definition for equity as it relates to personalized competency-based learning. It is critical for states to identify the populations for whom opportunities and outcomes have been inequitable and determine how personalized competency-based learning can work towards addressing those inequities. And I will be passing the mic soon to Jon, but I'm going to add one more prompt into the chat feature, and I'll just voice this over as I do so. We would love to hear which recommendations you find most helpful, and also what additional questions could be addressed with further research. So I will add that in the chat now. And then I will share the floor or pass the mic on over to Jon from KnowledgeWorks.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's great to be here. And just as a quick recap, my name is Jon Alfuth, and I'm the Director of State Policy at KnowledgeWorks. In my role, I'm a member of what we call our policy and advocacy team inside KnowledgeWorks, where we work to help states create the conditions that allow schools and districts to implement personalized competency-based education approaches. So that involves working with departments of education, legislators, state executives, and local stakeholders through things like advocacy, technical assistance, and thought leadership to achieve this. So in closing out, I'm going to quickly cover some of the high-level implications of these findings based on our experience in state policy implementation work. And then just as a reminder, if you do have questions, we'll have a small period of time at the end for some Q&A. So please do exercise that Q&A option in the Zoom platform so that we make sure that we get to those. First, on the next slide, just some high-level takeaways, and I'll talk through each of these. So from a state level, systems change takes time. It takes time and effort, and sometimes it can be years to fully implement the types of changes that are needed to foster the growth of these types of learning systems. This is something that's one of the core lessons that we've really come to believe at KnowledgeWorks, that you really have to do things with people and not to them, and that takes time. So this requires a strong coalition of stakeholders, which play a key role in designing these systems. These are also essential folks for advocating for continuity across time and political changes that may take place. If a governor turns over, if a state chief leaves and a new person comes in, there needs to be a strong group of folks that are continuing to advocate for this type of approach so that it doesn't just fall off and become the product of one individual's policy priorities. That's why the state leadership model from decision point 4 is so important, as well as putting in place that statutory and legal consideration that's going to be needed to make those initial conditions and set students or schools and districts up for future success. Something else to consider, schools and districts have a lot on their plates, especially after the past 2 years. So there's the really practical reality that schools and districts are going to need the time, space, and supports to make these changes, even as they're grappling with all of the other disruptive things that have taken place during that time. Second, just wanted to highlight that the communication strategy is incredibly important and really matters. It's key every step along the way. Stakeholders need to understand what's happening. This is a whole new approach to education for a lot of folks. It's very different from anything that they've done in the past. So there need to be a lot of steps that are taken to help people understand why it's net positive, the implication for students, and then really thinking about, how do you respond to some of the misconceptions, things like this is just going faster, or this is just putting kids in front of computers, which neither of those things are true, but is something that often comes up in our work. So communication strategies really need to be created to address these things head on. And thinking about these, it's really important to engage that broad coalition of stakeholders in line with the recommendation that Mary highlighted. This includes not only K-12 providers, but also parents, students, and families, community partners, workforce entities, and post-secondary education providers. I just really want to call out to Nevada here, which is a state we've been working in fairly recently, where a number of our teams have been working over the past few months and will be working over the next couple of years to really engage stakeholders in this long planning and policy implementation process. This is a great example where we're doing some work in that space. Third piece, every state is different, and at the same time, every state wants to know what every other state is doing. So how each state approaches this work, as RFA did a great job of highlighting, is going to be fundamentally grounded in state-specific context. That said, a lot of these states really exercise multiple pieces of these. If it wasn't apparent from Mark's slide earlier, often these types of things that were outlined in decision point 3 are part of a broader movement. For example, you'll recall Nevada used state legislation, a pilot program, and a task force to really get where it is today, and other states may need to take different approaches to this. There may be also different stakeholders that need to be engaged. For example, in some places, a state policymaker may have a different role than the same policymaker does in another place. So one approach in one state may not be appropriate for another state. This could impact the catalyst for decision points 1, 2, and 3, And then, the most common question, just in closing this particular point, that we get from states is they want to know what are other states doing. So states can and really do draw on each other for knowledge and expertise, which we often do at KnowledgeWorks. I often will say that that's the number one thing that states want to know about. What are other states doing? This has been vital in informing the work in all of the states that we do, and especially true as student-centered learning work is something that is still growing. We need to find those proof points, be able to highlight them from one state to another. And then fourth and last, districts really need guidance to support and act on state policy flexibilities. 100% agree with RFA's tagging this is a key state level condition to support the work. It doesn't work out, unfortunately, like things do in the movie Field of Dreams. The building of the structures does not guarantee that they will come. Translation of policy to practice is really key, which is especially important to decisions point 5, 6, and really key to number 7. Developing an actual change plan can be key in helping districts think about how do we get from point A to point B? How do you envision moving from where you are now in a traditional system to one that is fully student-centered? To Chris's point earlier from the chat regarding Washington, the details really matter because sometimes there can be roadblocks that can be small things that might not be apparent at first. Something as simple as state requirement for instructional time, or how a calendar has to work out, or whether or not a school has to still meet content standards within the context of making a shift to personalized education. These can be things that can derail that type of movement. So things that where districts and schools really need that kind of guidance for how do we make sure we're doing this and how can we walk through each of these steps. On the next slide, I just want to highlight very briefly our state policy framework, which Mary alluded to, and I also just dropped the link in the chat here. So you can see our 12-part state policy framework, which is organized into 4 strategy areas. I'm not going to go into each of these, but just wanted to make sure to highlight this and share the link for folks that are really interested in learning more about the type of structures and frameworks that we really work with states on. So on the last slide, what I really want to go through is just some of the more common pieces that come out of that state policy framework that we often run into. So this is not exhaustive, and these aren't in any particular order. I think I actually tried to go alphabetically, which I'm realizing now I think I may have failed at that. But these are some of, again, more high-profile examples of policy areas that can either provide opportunities or act as roadblocks to the type of transformations that we really want to get to. So assessment and accountability, when they're designed to be mutually reinforcing, they can be an opportunity. They can also hinder systems if they are built around conflicting priorities. Graduation requirements and college and career pathways can provide opportunities to demonstrate mastery of competencies. And if they aren't structured to allow those types of things, again, it can also be a roadblock. Funding systems. When funding can be used by schools and districts to support this work, it can be a really beneficial thing. It can also act as an impediment when things like funding formulas make it difficult to provide flexibilities from things like seat time requirements. Higher education requirements often acts as a perceived impediment, even though higher ed institutions are often positively received transcripts based on competencies. A lot of parents and educators may believe that these systems impact students' ability to matriculate to college. Legal flexibilities, things like seat time flexibilities or innovation zones can be a huge help or hindrance. You clearly can't implement student-centered visions if you're not legally able to do so. Statewide vision, things like a portrait of a graduate and statewide competencies can really serve as that baseline floor for building out student-centered learning environments. And then lastly, teacher supports are crucial. As a former educator myself, I know how vital it is to make sure that you are fully understanding of how to implement new systems and structures. And so it doesn't just become another initiative that has come here today and gone tomorrow. Ran through that really quick. Happy to answer any questions along with our colleagues. In closing, just wanted to plug 2 quick things. Here's my email in the chat. I'm very happy to answer any questions that folks may have and follow up to the webinar. I also do just want to really quick plug that we are having another webinar to Carl's question. I dropped this in the chat earlier, but focusing on legislative changes in this past legislative session later this month. So if you're interested in what's been going on more recently in states around student-centered learning across the country, feel free to tune in. We'd love to hear from you. Mary and Mark, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, John. Move to our Q&A slide. And I actually think, John, this first question might be one that you would like to chime in. So that's good timing. So the question that we received, one of the questions we received in the Q&A, and I'll try my best to paraphrase it here, what has driven states to really make this effort? So I think part of this question is kind of like beyond just policy change, but what has really driven states to make this change?
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, along with the kind of the catalyst that we talked about and a real interest in innovation and flexibility, what I heard time and again at both the district level and the state level is there's just nothing more powerful than observing the work and getting excited about it. Going to, people talked about going to other states or other districts in their state and seeing the level of engagement that students were experiencing when being in a personalized competency-based learning space, and just the difference in what that looked like compared to traditional instruction. And so I think there's few things more powerful than really seeing it in action and seeing the experiences of students that seem to be positive. So observation seems to be a way to really get people on board.
I think I'll just add that from those that we heard from in this study, part of what kind of just kept coming up is that the old way of doing things is not working for far too many students, and that something needs to change. And what better thing to change than making a student's journey in our education systems personalized and really cater to their interests and what sparks their joy in the school buildings that they spend so much time in. So that's something that definitely stuck with me too. John, would you like to add on?
Sure, I would just add to, there's been a lot of great, I think, polling information lately showing that students and parents are really, questioning to the extent to which public education is preparing students for the future. I think policymakers are having, the same questions, and that could be in part spurring a lot of this movement for thinking about how do we personalize learning so that students are really prepared for what comes next for them. But I agree too with everything Mary, Mark, and you said.
I think we have time for, well, maybe not. Rebecca, I might need to pass it to you because it is 4:59. So hoping for maybe one more.
I can be super quick. Do you want to tackle that one other question that's in there?
Yeah, I don't know if this is a quick one or not, but this might be one that we can always follow up on if it is not. Another question came up from Christopher here, that what features of state accountability systems and associated assessments, so such as the framework slide mentioned, where there's balanced assessment, are necessary to support personalized competency-based learning?
This is an excellent question for John to follow up on. Mark, do you?
Yeah, I was going to say I'm going to pass to John on that.
Yep. One. Yeah, John, do you want to follow? I actually can connect you. Hi, Chris, and happy to connect you all offline, because it is not a 30-second question. You're right,
yes.
Mary.
Chris, if you would be willing to shoot me your email, we actually just released, and I haven't pulled them up on our website, but a couple of great resources focused on assessment and accountability policies I would love to flag for you. But that would probably answer it better than I could in 30 seconds.
And again, feel free to email John. I'll also put, and this goes to anyone, feel free to email John or myself. I know it is a question high on lots of folks' mind, and it is definitely something that John and the policy team at KnowledgeWorks are spending a lot of time thinking about and have written about. So just briefly, thank you all. It was a wonderful, I would say, coalition of the willing to see the participants. So I would just encourage you, as you get the report, please share it with your colleagues. As I said in my opening remarks, just so genuinely excited in just a mere decade to see the growth of this work. We know a whole lot more, and thanks to this research with Research for Action, we're going to hopefully be able to keep taking it to a larger scale and ensuring that more of our most marginalized and resilient learners are exposed and able to have the kind of rich, joyful learning experiences that is possible from some of this work.